All right, we're back in the FITSNews studios. We've got an ultra mega version of the Week in Review this week. Tons of news to cover. The South Carolina partisan political primary elections, which this news outlet has been covering in depth for the last few months, maybe even the last year. They've finally come and gone. And we've got answers that will not only impact the future of the state of South Carolina, but also that 2024 presidential race, as the proxy wars in South Carolina between Donald Trump, the former president, and the Republican establishment were raging and are in fact still raging even after these races are over. We're going to tell you all about that. We've also got a huge block of Murdaugh-related news this week, folks. New jailhouse calls. This news outlet fought for them. We got them. We've got multiple stories up already on FITSNews.com, but we're going to walk you through some of the highlights of the latest batch of jailhouse calls from Alex Murdaugh. We've also got some big news regarding Alex Murdaugh's law status. Folks, he was disbarred this week, pending a hearing later this month before the South Carolina Supreme Court. But the Office of Disciplinary Counsel, which regulates attorney conduct in South Carolina, has decided to disbar Alex Murdaugh pending that hearing later this month. We're going to tell you all about that. Last but not least, we had a very special guest in the studio this week who's intimately involved in one of the key Murdaugh civil cases. Wes Donehue, the self-proclaimed knife fighter. Actually, I guess some media outlets proclaimed him thusly. But Wes came in the studio looking quite dapper, I might add, quite dapper, for an interview related to his new book, which deals with crisis communications and reputation management in the age of cancel culture. All that and much more heading your way on the Week in Review. So much political news, where to start? South Carolina, a day of decision. We're going to start with the turnout, folks. I actually expected turnout for this week's partisan primary elections in South Carolina to be much lower than it was. We didn't have any real statewide races on the Republican side, which is where most of the votes are. So I didn't think a lot of folks would be participating in this election. But 100,000 plus people voted early, and a total of 580,000 plus voted in this election. That's about a 16% turnout rate, people, which is, again, not great. You go back to 2010, or about 24% of registered voters turned out. Then you got a low point back in 2012 where only about 11.5% showed up. So this is right around in the middle. It's about normal for turnout in South Carolina. But if you look at these races, the way things shook out, obviously the two biggest races that everyone was following, not just in South Carolina, but nationally, and I'm talking about the South Carolina 1st Congressional District and the South Carolina 7th Congressional District. Now, if you look at the map here, these are two districts on the Palmetto State's 187-mile coastline and various parts inland. But we're talking in the 7th District, the Redneck Riviera, Myrtle Beach, of tourism mecca. Then down in the 1st District, we're talking about Charleston, Beaufort, Bluffton, and the Palmetto Low Country. So these are the two battlegrounds where we saw incumbents who were challenged by Trump-backed opponents. And how did they do? Well, guess what, folks? It was a split decision for Donald Trump in South Carolina. The former president, he won a race and he lost a race. We're going to start the race he lost because I think that's the one that Trump was really focused on and the one that I believe spells real trouble for him in South Carolina in 2024. That race pitted Nancy Mace. Now, Nancy Mace is a first-term congresswoman. She won the seat back in 2020 when she vanquished incumbent Democrat Joe Cunningham. Mace was targeted by Trump very aggressively because she spoke out against him in the aftermath of the January 6, 2021 riots. In fact, Mace said on the day after those riots that Trump's entire legacy was wiped out by the violence that took place at the U.S. Capitol. Now, heat of the moment comments that she made. Again, I wasn't there. I've never really slammed Nancy Mace for making those comments, but there was a segment of the South Carolina Republican base that was just done with her. After she made those comments, they were just done with her. And Trump, very clearly done with her, because here's why Trump was so upset, folks, and we reported this exclusively earlier this year. Nancy Mace actually used to work for Trump. In fact, she was one of his top 3 staffers in 2016 when he ran for the presidential nomination the first time. And she was one of the key players in his first in the South presidential victory. So Trump endorsed Mace when she ran for Congress, but he was cautioned against it because some of his advisors told him, listen, she's not really with you. She'll stab you in the back the first chance she gets. Now, did they know something I didn't know? I don't know. I've never really known Nancy Mace to be that kind of person. But in the aftermath of January 6th, Nancy Mace was harshly critical of Trump. And if there's one thing that Trump doesn't like, sources close to him tell me he does not like it when staffers come back to him and say, hey, we told you so. We told you so, which is exactly what happened with Nancy Mace. So Trump dives in to this race, guns blazing. There's tons of ads slamming Nancy Mace for her record, for votes that she's cast, and for her criticism of the former president. And the race was very close, people. It could have really gone either way. Katie Arrington, the former state representative who challenged Mace in this race, she'd run for this district before. In fact, she won the Republican nomination for the seat back in 2018 before losing the election to Joe Cunningham. But just a very bitter race. These two candidates didn't like each other at all. They were throwing allegations of one of them was a liar, one of them lost their security clearance. It was just vindictive. It was bitter. And here's the interesting thing. On election night, after Mace successfully defended her seat, won this primary election, Katie Arrington got before her crowd and said, I want you to know I'm going to support Nancy Mace in the fall to help her beat the Democrat in this district. And I want all of you to do the same. So she not only endorsed Mace, but she called on her supporters to support her. But while she was doing that, guess what else was going on behind the scenes? Arrington's campaign was apparently preparing a legal challenge to the results of the election. Now, was the race close? No, wasn't close. Nancy Mace won by about 6%, roughly 5,000 votes. So this race was not close. It was a race that Mace won with room to spare. So I don't exactly know what kind of challenge Katie Arrington is pushing. We have heard some reports of roughly 100 ballots down in Beaufort County that were sent to the wrong precinct. Voters got the wrong ballot. Is that enough to impact the outcome of the election? No. And we've heard a few isolated stories from Charleston, but at this point, really nothing to justify an electoral challenge, at least nothing that's been presented to us. So that was the first race. That was the first big race that people were watching. And I'm talking Politico did national coverage of this. The Washington Post did a huge exclusive on this race the day before the election. So a ton of national attention on this race. Up the coast, though, Trump won a huge victory. And in this race, we're talking about incumbent Tom Rice, who was one of 10 GOP members of the House who voted to impeach Trump after the January 6th riots. So let's rewind the tape here. This was an interesting race because Tom Rice doubled down on this vote. In fact, Tom Rice did everything he could to hammer home the fact that, yes, he believed Donald Trump betrayed not only the Republican Party, but the American people. He believed that Trump put him, Tom Rice, and other lawmakers in physical danger. Rice just absolutely would not back down from this vote. And in fact, his wife, Renzi Rice, even took it a step further. She compared Trump to Hitler, called his supporters a cult. Again, we can argue that point, but the bottom line is that was not a smart thing for her to do in a Republican primary race in a district that Trump won by 58%, both in 2016 and 2018. So whether she's right or not, we can debate that, but it was an incredibly politically stupid thing for her to say. So Rice was in big trouble. And the general thinking on this race was that he and his challenger, Russell Fry, the South Carolina House Majority Whip, the thinking was that the two of them would probably end up going to a runoff election. And I want to just real quickly explain how that works. In South Carolina, in a multi-candidate race, if nobody gets a majority of votes, they take the top two vote getters and they do a runoff election 2 weeks later, head-to-head, to find out who wins. So in this race, there were 7 candidates. Not all of them very credible, but no one expected Russell Fry, the Trump candidate, no one expected him to win this race outright. But sure enough, on election night, Russell Fry, despite being a very fiscally liberal lawmaker, a guy who voted for the gas tax, a huge 71% gas tax increase that is literally crushing South Carolina motorists right now, despite this, Russell Fry won with 51.1% of the vote. So that tells you something, people. That tells you that Donald Trump is hugely strong, hugely popular, hugely viable as a political force in that 7th district, up in that redneck Riviera area, obviously lower incomes, lower education attainment. These are Trump voters, people. We've heard this narrative all over the country. Meanwhile, down in the 1st district, which is a little bit higher income, more educated voter, Trump didn't do so well there. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out moving forward, particularly in 2024, because while Trump had a split decision in South Carolina on election night, there was one national Republican figure who had a huge night. and I'm talking about Nikki Haley. Now, if you're a regular member of our audience, you know this news outlet has a little history with Nikki Haley, and I'm shuddering to think what Dylan Nolan, our Director of Special Projects, is putting on the screen right now. But say what you will about Nikki Haley, she had a huge night. She did two things in this election cycle in South Carolina that were incredibly smart. Number one, she got ahead of the curve in that first district race. She endorsed Nancy Mace before Trump could jump in, supporting his own challenger, so that she was already on the record supporting Mace before Trump got in. That gives her the flexibility to say, hey, look, I'm not going up against the president, former president rather. I just picked my candidate. He came in the race afterward. I can't help that. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant move. But also, Haley was smart enough not to get involved in that 7th district race against Rice, who was basically doomed from the start based on his impeachment vote. So Haley stayed out of that race, and she got in the 1st district race at exactly the right time. So again, I don't know who's advising Nikki Haley right now. Obviously, she stepped on it just like Nancy Mace did in the aftermath of the Capitol riots back in 2021. She ticked off a lot of Republican primary voters with her remarks, just like Mace back then. But some incredibly deft political moves by Nikki Haley in a state that is absolutely essential to any Republican who has presidential aspirations. Now, is Nikki gunning for the presidency herself? Well, obviously, right? But the question is when. The question is when. And we did notice just last week, Haley's family was down in Mar-a-Lago, got to visit, her son got to take his picture with former President Trump. Could there be an alliance brewing there? We're going to keep a close eye on that. That's something this news outlet has followed. But again, a big night for Nikki Haley in South Carolina this week during the partisan primary elections. She scored a knockout win while, again, Donald Trump, the former president, ended up with only a split decision. All right, so these two huge congressional races weren't the only races we were watching. There were several statewide partisan primaries of interest, starting on the Democratic side with the race for governor of South Carolina, particularly which Democrat's going to get beat in the fall by South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster, the Republican nominee. So that was a race that Democrats worked really hard to keep under the radar. And this news outlet provided a lot of coverage on that, pointing out that back in 2018, in the last Democratic race, there were 3 televised debates between the all-white field of candidates. But this time, with the first black female running for this office, no televised debates, at least not until this news outlet made it an issue, shamed the front runner in that race into holding one of those debates. Now, unfortunately, they held it after the early voting period, which sort of defeated the purpose because a lot of people had already made up their minds at that point. But they did hold a debate. Joe Cunningham ended up winning this race running away by a much larger margin than most people expected. But again, a big part of that was the fact that the Democratic Party did nothing, absolutely nothing, to drive voter turnout in this election cycle. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. Every year, or every primary year, parties are allowed to put questions on the ballot as a way of generating voter interest. For example, this year, I don't know, let's think of hot button issues. Abortion, right? It's a huge issue across the country right now. Racial justice, right? Something to get progressives out to the polls, a Democratic base to come out and vote. They didn't do any of that. They didn't submit any ballot questions. So you've got the progressive base at home sitting on its hands, and basically moderate Joe Cunningham with the support of the Democratic establishment, mainly Dick Harpootlian. That's right, folks, the same guy from the Murdaugh murders, crime, and corruption saga, the same guy who's pulling the strings on that drama, is a huge kingmaker in the Democratic Party. In fact, he's a former Democratic Party chairman. So Dick Harpootlian is one of Joe Cunningham's biggest backers. So Harpootlian made absolutely sure that his horse was going to win that race, which Cunningham did running away. So we've got Joe Cunningham, the new Democratic nominee for governor of South Carolina. On the Republican side, the big race was for superintendent of education. Now, I pointed out in the past, this is a position that doesn't have a lot of actual power. It's kind of a ceremonial, not quite ministerial, but there's really very little that this office does. Local school boards set most of the education policy in this state, and when it comes to funding and other matters, all of that is dominated by the South Carolina General Assembly. So this is an office that's kind of, they have some say. If it's a failing school district, they can come in and rescue it. They do publish the school report cards and other, accountability measures. But by and large, this is just not a very influential position. So the fact that multiple Republican and Democratic candidates ran for it was kind of like, okay, what's the point here? But on the Republican side, that race ended in a runoff. There's going to be two candidates vying against each other in 2 weeks' time. They are Kathy Manis, who is a town of Lexington councilwoman. She's supported by the current superintendent, Molly Spearman, who's a former Democrat. I say former. I don't think Molly Spearman ever quit being a Democrat any more than I think Kathy Manis is not a Democrat. But anyway, Manis is sort of the more left-leaning candidate. And then you've got more in the middle, the mushy middle, I would say. You've got Ellen Weaver, who is a policy analyst from Greenville, South Carolina. Manis finished ahead of Weaver in this race, but because neither one of them got 50%, again, that means they go to a runoff election head-to-head in 2 weeks' time. This news outlet covered that education race very closely, and we're going to continue to follow it over the next 2 weeks, and we'll keep you tuned on that. Now, there were a few other races that we found very interesting over this election cycle, some local races, and one of them we covered here in a minute, and it got me in a little trouble last week, didn't it, Dylan? I was wearing, what was it? I made an Apu joke. Let's rewind and do the little rewind thing. I'm about as dumb as they come when it comes to political stuff, okay? I will say anything. I will do anything. I have no filter, okay? I get my mouth gets me in trouble all the time. I do stupid stuff literally all the time. All the time, at work, at home. I'm just an idiot. All right, so the race I'm talking about is a Kershaw County Council race involving a candidate who 4 years ago ran for office and forgot to take this photo off of his Facebook page. Right. Okay, so apparently there's no education in the second kick of a mule, and this candidate, Brant Tomlinson, decided to run again. Well, guess what, folks? He didn't win, but he is in a runoff election. There were three candidates in that race. He finished second in the vote, it looks like. Yep, just barely actually missed out on finishing first. He got 42.7% of the vote. So blackface Brant Tomlinson, he'll be heading back to the polls in Kershaw County. We'll keep an eye on that race as we see whether or not the scandal cost him a second time. So obviously a ton of political news in South Carolina this week that we covered, but also it was a huge week in the Murdaugh murders, crime, and corruption saga. And while we didn't get the murder indictments in this case that everyone's been waiting on for the last year, we did find jailhouse calls in the mailbox, people. Everybody loves the jailhouse calls, right? Everybody loves the jailhouse calls. 10-4, Bo. 10-4, right? So anyway, a new batch of calls arrived in the mail this week, and to say that the newsroom was buzzing, that'd be putting it far too mildly, folks. This was like all everybody was doing this week. And I love the fact that we've got such a great team. Mandy Matney down in Hilton Head, Liz Farrell, Dylan Nolan, Jen Wood, our researcher, just dove into these calls, all hands on deck, breaking them down, finding where the news was. Because again, this is an insight into a guy at the center of arguably the biggest criminal story South Carolina's ever going to see. So some people said, oh, this isn't news. Well, that's BS. It's clearly news. And I think our position on that was borne out this week by some of the contents of these calls. And the first clip I want to cut to is kind of important because it involves Alec Murdaugh openly discussing the fact that he and his family members are moving assets around before the court takes away their ability to do so. I want to cut to that clip first. Let's take a listen.
Hey, John.
Yep.
In court the other day, they made a big deal about things. They're going to be moving to try to prevent us from selling stuff.
Right.
We need to get as much as we can completed. I just know that they're getting ready to file, and I mean, I don't know if it's going to be a day or a week or, 2 weeks. And, I mean, they would theoretically have to serve me or Buster, but
right.
Buster doesn't accept service.
Well, let me ask you a question, Alex. So, I'll follow up with Randy and Mark on that. But the dump truck and excavator.
Yeah.
Do you have an issue if I buy them and put the money towards it?
No issue at all.
I mean, that'll be the easiest way to do a sale.
So that was just one of the storylines that these calls contained. Another was Alec Murdaugh discussing with his sister-in-law, Lizzie, his getting shot in the head, allegedly. We're still waiting to see this wound on that pristine redheaded noggin of his. But the shooting, the bizarre roadside shooting last September, in which Alec Murdaugh was allegedly shot in the head by his partner in crime, cousin Eddie. So Curtis Edward Smith allegedly shoots Alec Murdaugh in the head. Alec discusses this with Lizzie and says he doesn't feel any dumber from getting shot in the head. Okay, well, I would say you probably have to actually get shot in the head as opposed to, maybe getting nicked or whatever. I've gotten nicked before. I've got one of those things on here. We'll show it. We'll get a little close up of that a little bit later. Dylan will do a little picture of that. That's getting nicked, Bo.
I mean, now for a second I thought to myself, am I dead? It didn't take me long to realize I wasn't dead. Then the next thing that occurred is, oh my God, I'm really going to be messed up. I'm going to be blind. And then it started quickly coming back. But I could reach back and feel my head, and I knew my head wasn't missing. I could tell it was bleeding, but I could tell it wasn't like a big section of my head blown off.
All right, so Murdaugh also talks about life behind bars. He talks about his workout regimen, mountain climbers, and burpees. And once again, he's apparently in the best shape of his life, which I hope so. Because that Glen, man, the Alvin S. Glen Detention Center, that's a rough place. I've been there twice, not for as long as Alec Murdaugh, but that's a rough neighborhood, people. So I'm glad he's in good shape, right? We heard a lot more about meat sticks, people, which is apparently the currency of choppers in the Alvin Glen Detention Center, meat sticks. I can't help but chuckle every time I hear meat sticks, right? It's almost like those meth tacos. Give me some meth tacos with some meat sticks, people. But we heard a lot about that. We heard about jail life. Alec Murdaugh talked about his crusty sock, that he has trouble washing his crusty socks. All right, okay, we got that action there. But he also talks about how nice people are to him in the jail. Apparently he is a revered celebrity, one of the august occupants of the Alvin S. Glen Detention Center, who is treated with respect wherever he goes.
Have you sold your shoes yet?
No, not yet. I was getting ready to, though, man, because, I got one pair of socks. They're so nasty now, but I can't wash them because then your feet get cold at night. But I ordered me some tube socks from the canteen, so I got me 2 pairs of tube socks coming Monday.
So do you live by yourself, or do you have, cellmates?
Oh, no. That's one thing. I have, I have no interaction of any substance with anybody other than, 30 seconds with some of the trustees and, a little bit of interaction with the guards. I have a whole pod to myself. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 rooms in my pod. I have a little TV at the end of the hallway, but there's only one channel.
So there's nobody else in there?
No.
Well, is that because you're, being held because there's a judgment coming up, or?
Nah, it's for my safety, because I'm all over the television and TV, and they've been very nice to me in here. I will be the first to say that they have been wonderfully nice to me, very courteous.
Again, a fascinating look inside the mind of Alec Murdaugh, the man who is at the heart of this still unspooling criminal saga. And we've got much more to come with these jailhouse calls because there was a ton of them, people. We were provided with a ton of calls. More calls are on the way. And guess what, folks? We're going to hear even more, as I mentioned at the lead, because Alec Murdaugh is about to have an opportunity to step out of the Alvin S. Glen Detention Center and make his case before the South Carolina Supreme Court. And I want to tell you a little bit about what that's about in our next segment. All right, so the other big news in the Murdaugh murders, crime and corruption saga this week, Alec Murdaugh disbarred by the South Carolina Supreme Court. Well, almost. This past week, on Thursday afternoon, the Supreme Court issued a ruling in connection with Murdaugh's case before the Office of Disciplinary Counsel. Now, this is the group which regulates lawyer conduct in South Carolina to the extent, lawyers' conduct in South Carolina can be regulated. We're living in a cesspool of lawyer corruption down here. But anyway, which we've seen in this case over and over. But anyway, because Murdaugh got caught, because his case has blown up, because it is a national story, guess what? Guess what? The court has decided to take action against him, and they've already suspended his ability to practice law. That happened last year in the immediate aftermath of the arrest. But now, Thursday, 2 days ago, court issued a ruling in which it found that Murdaugh should be disbarred. And I wanted to read from this opinion because it's not quite a done deal, but I wanted to read from this opinion. This was issued by the South Carolina Supreme Court Chief Justice Donald Beatty. He wrote, and I quote, "In this unique case, respondents' admissions in the public record lead to only one conclusion, that respondent's egregious ethical misconduct subjects him to the most significant sanction available, disbarment. Accordingly, we find there is no need to expend additional resources to proceed through the normal disciplinary process. Instead, this court may act under the court's constitutional authority to regulate the practice of law in South Carolina and may remove an unfit lawyer from the practice to ensure the public administration of justice is protected." That's bold, people. They're literally skipping the due process. And again, I don't know if that's right. I mean, Alec Murdaugh clearly, more than any attorney in recent memory, any attorney I've ever recalled, clearly violated the canons of his profession. But this is an interesting development. The Supreme Court literally cut into the chase saying we believe he should be disbarred without a hearing. Now, Murdaugh will have an opportunity June 22nd, later this month. He will have an opportunity to address the court and offer up his rationale as to why he should not have his law license taken away from him permanently. Again, this is not a suspension. He's already been suspended. This is disbarment, folks. It's a big deal. But that hearing will be held at 11 a.m., June 22nd, 22, at the South Carolina Supreme Court. Obviously, count on FITSNews to bring you all the latest developments from that as we continue to lead the coverage of this unspooling crime and corruption saga. All right, so one of my favorite things to do here in the studio is to bring in interesting guests. Obviously, a couple of weeks ago, we had Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter, the attorneys in the Murdaugh murder's civil side, who got this ball rolling on the civil side. And that ball sort of snowballed. It's turned into almost an avalanche. And one of the people caught up in that avalanche, Wes Donehue. Now, Wes, longtime South Carolina political consultant who made it big nationally when he and his company worked with SeaWorld to salvage that company's reputation in the aftermath of the orca scandal, the killer whale that actually killed somebody at SeaWorld and raised a whole scandal over captive whales. And Wes Donehue's company was the company that came in and helped SeaWorld rehabilitate its image. He's out with a new crisis management book, and he came in, this was the first interview he's done on the new book. But he came in here, I think, for another reason, because we grilled him on his involvement in the Murdaugh murders, crime, and corruption case on the civil side. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Murdaugh story exploded not on June 7, 2021, with the double homicide at Moselle that left 52-year-old Maggie Murdaugh and 22-year-old Paul Murdaugh dead. It actually exploded, at least in South Carolina, a year and a half earlier. And I'm talking about the boat crash from February 2019, in which Paul Murdaugh allegedly slammed a boat owned by his dad into a piling on a bridge, Archers Creek Bridge, down in Beaufort County, South Carolina. Now, this crash killed 19-year-old Mallory Beach. And again, this is the case that thrust the Murdaughs on the statewide stage. Paul Murdaugh was criminally charged in that case. In fact, at the time of his murder, he was facing 3 felony boating under the influence charges, which could have landed him in jail for a significant amount of time. So that case was ongoing on the criminal side, but there was a wrongful death case in which Donehue's firm has become ensnared. Now, who was Donehue working for? He and his firm, they were hired for apparently $25,000 a month. Wow, it's good work if you can get it. By Greg Parker, Parker's Kitchen. That's the convenience store, the gas stations down there in the South Carolina Low Country. Parker owns these gas stations, a gas pumping dude, whatever. He hired Donehue because his convenience store was one of the companies that were sued in this civil case. And they were sued because, guess what? Paul Murdaugh went in there using a fake ID belonging to his brother and bought a bunch of booze, right? And so they are alleging that that contributed to the crash that killed Mallory Beach, and obviously the crash that propelled this entire saga out of the shadows down there in the 14th Circuit. So we brought Wesley in, And we wanted to talk to him because he was actually threatened with legal action just for scheduling this interview with us. He literally got threats from Parker's attorneys just for coming on this show. So I wanted to cut to that, but we had some interesting discussions first. Before we get into that, I wanted to cut to what Wes had to say about Greg Parker, the guy he used to work for. He had an unflattering comparison. Let's take a listen. What's he like?
I guess I could talk about that, right?
I mean,
I got somebody behind the scenes, Christiana, telling me what I can and can't talk about. Look, I don't want to. Around the office, I refer to him as Lord Farquaad.
I was about to say, man, he's giving off some serious little dick energy or something.
Well, if you've seen Shrek,
I can say that.
If you've seen Shrek, I refer to him as Lord Farquaad, and I think that kind of sums up my view of him.
Right. Not a very flattering description. He wants to win.
I just got to be careful. I don't want the guy coming after me because he's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and while I'm doing decent in my life and can afford nice cufflinks, I can't afford a lawsuit against a man who just is worth that much money.
Well, it sounds like he needs to buy your book.
It sounds like it.
Read it, or maybe listen to some. I'm sure you didn't give him, advice to stink the thing up the way he has at this point. I mean, I think this was a case that most people would have settled a long time ago. All right, so an interesting exchange with Wes, and I encourage you to listen to the whole interview because there's an unanswered question to the whole thing that continues to drive me nuts because I'm sitting there thinking, I like Wes. He's a good guy. We go way back. I take him at his word when he comes in here to talk to us. But one of the things that was unanswered by this interview, is a question of why would Wes Donehue be threatened for talking about this case? Why would they forbid the attorneys in this case from releasing his work product related to it if he wasn't doing anything a little outside the bounds? It doesn't add up. If all your work is boring tort reform work, which is what Wes and his crew were allegedly hired to do, that's not controversial. You can release that, right? There's nothing controversial about that. But Wes says he didn't do anything wrong. He says he didn't do anything below the belt. He was very passionate, in fact, in defending his work and his integrity. He said he would never do some of the things that have been accused in this case. Okay, well, if that's true, why couldn't they let him talk? I just don't understand. There's a disconnect there, and I think hopefully at some point we'll find out exactly what kind of work that Donehue's firm did and exactly why Greg Parker wants to keep it a secret. All right, so that's a wrap for this week's editions of the Week in Review. This is actually our sixth take of the outro, which tells you that my brain is already on vacation, which, by the way, yes, next 2 weeks, I will be out of the chair. I will be on an undisclosed location, Sarah J's Seafood in Garden City, if you want to buy me some fried seafood. I'll be out of town for 2 weeks on the South Carolina coast with my wife and 7 kids. And yes, 7 kids, vacation, no, not synonymous at all. It's like you're out on the beach, this ant mound just explodes. And there's kids like everywhere. Like we don't have the sense to dress these kids the same. Like they're all different colored. Stuff just flying every which way. But we're going to take these jihadis, these terrorists, these asymmetrical little warriors. We're going to take them to the South Carolina coast for 2 weeks. I'll be back in the chair early July. Look forward to continuing to hold South Carolina politicians, leaders, those who are running afoul of the law accountable for their actions, holding those who are entrusted with your tax dollars accountable for how they spend that money. And again, continue to provide you with the very latest on breaking news here in the Palmetto State. Look forward to being back in early July. Thanks for tuning in to the Week in Review.